Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from A History of Modern Sabah by K.G. Tregonning, from Chapter 1, The American Colony. By the middle of the 19th century, various attempts had been made by European powers to settle in Borneo. Almost without exception, they had failed. The Portuguese had contented themselves with the most infrequent of trading visits. From Manila, the Spanish had sent an embassy and later a punitive expedition against piratical Brunei. The Dutch were clinging precariously to the southern coast, and the British, after the failures of Sokodana, Banjarmasin, and Balambangan, were in possession of the minute island of Labuan in Brunei Bay. Ceded by the Sultan of Brunei in 1846 and ratified by treaty the following year, the island had been occupied partly to tap the trade of the northern islands and partly to make safe the China seas. British China-bound ships, after passing the three well-lit bazaars of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore in the dark thieves' alley of the Malacca Straits, faced a lonely and perilous path across the China Sea to Canton. Labuan and Hong Kong lessened the dangers. By order of Palmerston, the island was occupied, and the first civil governor was James Brooke, who, alone of the adventurous Englishmen who had tried, had succeeded in settling in Borneo. Both Alexander Hare in the south, though helped by Raffles, and Erskine Murray in the east had failed, as Wilson was to fail in Sumatra. Brooke was the exception. In return for annual payments, he was granted the governorship of a rebellious province by the Sultan of Brunei and gradually assumed authority over an ever-increasing area of the Sultan's territory. Aided occasionally by units of the British Navy, he drove away the pirate fleets from the north and slowly extended peace and order along the coastline of western Borneo. Apart from Great Britain, the only other Western power to enter into relations with the shrinking Sultanate of Brunei was the United States of America. There had been American interest in Southeast Asia as early as the close of the War of Independence. Idle privateers had found a market in America for Asian produce, and by 1801 some 30 or more ships annually reached Canton. It appears that their business was not always strictly legal, for it was reported from the newly founded Singapore that the pirates from Borneo were supplied with munitions from American craft, usually lying off Penang. And here, perhaps our transatlantic brethren have done some good, as the gunpowder they sell will not explode. By the early 1830s, when American clippers began sailing across the blue waters of the Pacific, diplomatic relations with Far Eastern countries were being established. America's policy was to obtain for herself all the advantages that had been secured by other Western powers in their individually negotiated treaties with Asian countries. An American visit to Brunei in 1845, in pursuit of this objective, had been fruitless, partly because of the blunderings of the drunken servant Raja Brooke had loaned as interpreter. The principle was affirmed in 1850, however, when a treaty was signed, securing for the USA all the privileges of the most favored nation. America transferred her interest to other countries, and again, as for centuries before, Brunei stagnated and decayed. Then, in 1865, came the first vital spark of the modern age. Writing in great alarm, the British consul at Sarawak told London that the Americans were implementing the almost forgotten treaty, that they had appointed a consul to Brunei, and that the efforts of Raja Brooke to annex more of the Sultan's territory might now come to naught. The American consul Charles Lee Moses ushers in a preposterous incident out of which was to emerge the British North Borneo Company. He appears to have been an adventurer, pure and simple, a discarded member of the lower deck of the United States Navy. On arrival at Labuan, the nearest port of call to Brunei for European vessels, he had to borrow money to pay his fare from Singapore, and his immediate and only object seems to have been the acquisition of wealth. He acted swiftly. Within a few days of his arrival at Brunei, he secured, on the promise of certain payments to the Sultan and the Pengiran Tumenggung, the heir to the throne, the cession for 10 years of a large tract of Brunei territory to the north. Armed with the cession papers, he left immediately for Hong Kong. His action had created grave alarm on Labuan. The British company working the coal mines feared that the American cession would prejudice British interests in North Borneo, by which they meant their own, while south in Sarawak there was a fluttering of the dovecotes with talk of the fine harbors America had acquired, and of how either alone or with her old ally France, then establishing herself in Indochina opposite, she could dispute the passage of the British fleet and intercept merchantmen in the China Sea. An American colony round a naval depot would inevitably absorb Brunei and then interfere with Brooke. So it was reasoned in Sarawak. Hastily, the dispatches sped to London. Meanwhile, Moses, swift to secure the concessions, sold them just as swiftly. They were acquired by two American merchants of Hong Kong, Joseph W. Torrey and Thomas B. Harris, and a Chinese partner, Wo Hang. He soon withdrew and was replaced by Li Asing and Pong Ampong. The four agreed in October 1865 to take over the cessions to form a company which they styled the American Trading Company of Borneo, and with $7,000 as capital to invest it in this newly acquired territory. Moses undertook to extend the protection of the United States to any settlement in Borneo in return for a third of the profits. He stipulated that no flag other than that of the United States was to be hoisted, and that the laws of the USA were to be adopted. A settlement in Borneo was decided upon, laborers collected, a dozen or so Americans interested in the scheme, and early in November, the party sailed. Torrey was appointed supreme ruler and governor, and given the titles of Raja of Ambong and Marudu, and Sir Maharaja of North Borneo by the Brunei Sultan, who vested him with the power of life and death over the inhabitants, the right to coin money and make laws, and all other powers and rights exercised by a sovereign ruler. Sailing north from Brunei, the little expedition settled at the mouth of the Kamanis River, some 60 miles away, where a track led into the interior. Here, 60 Chinese and 12 Americans settled on the small river plain, hacking at the jungle and mangrove to build a flimsy stockade and precarious jetty. The settlement, named Elena by Torrey, had fluttering over it by December 1865 not only the Star-Spangled Banner of the USA, but also the Red Star, the house flag of the American Trading Company. In an effort to raise funds, Torrey sped back to Hong Kong, appointing one Joseph W. Wheelwright to be lieutenant governor of the state of Bonomi and Kamanis, and advising him to encourage more worthy habits of morality and industry among the natives. In this he failed lamentably. While Torrey was away, Elena slowly stagnated. The chief secretary, Thomas B. Harris, who had helped Torrey to acquire the cessions from Moses in October, died in May, after an adventuresome trip through jungle and over the then unknown Crocker Mountain Range to Keningau. 3 other Americans left, and the laborers, whose term of service had expired, became more and more dissatisfied. They had cleared some 90 acres of swampy jungle land by the river and planted rice, sugarcane, and tobacco. But with hardly any money to buy food, and with very little rice stored in the settlement, they slowly starved. Moses, who had followed Torrey to Hong Kong, was becoming desperate. As no money could be extracted from Torrey, who was himself pressed by his Chinese partners who had supplied most of the funds, Moses turned to more disreputable acquaintances, aided by a glowing report in the Overland China Mail of the first American colony away from their homeland. He met a dozen or so Germans, bold, determined men, rich in an experience of lawlessness hard gained on the gold mining fields of Australia and California, and he persuaded them to leave their boarding houses in Macau and Hong Kong, and to sail with him to Borneo on a general filibustering expedition. Yet again, he was disappointed. The 16 Germans, led by a man named Rode, a former mercenary in the pay of the Taiping rebels, ran their ship aground on the old underwater barrier of stones guarding Brunei. There, they terrified the Sultan by saying that they were now Americans and had come to settle, but after one look at dying Elena, they departed without incident back to the inns and alleys of Macau, leaving Moses penniless and alone in the consulate of Brunei. The Kamanist settlement lasted a little longer, but was abandoned towards the end of 1866. Tory never returned. The laborers still living obtained employment in the decrepit coal mines of Labuan, where Moses made another attempt to secure some money. Wheelwright had rejected him at Elena and had thus been guilty, said Moses, of treason to the United States. He was to be equally unsuccessful at Labuan. Our last glimpse of this American venture is of Henkel, sent by Tory to superintend the evacuation, reporting to the governor of Labuan, Hugh Lowe, that the company had been a complete failure. Moses made a last gamble. After furtively firing his Atap hut, which bore the impressive title of United States Consulate, he demanded a large sum as compensation from the Sultan. He had not, however, received a single cent from either Moses or Tory throughout the whole sorry business. Moses stood no chance of securing money from him. A gunboat of the American Navy sent to investigate agreed with the Sultan and declined to press the charge. Moses left Labuan in 1867 and drowned on his way back to America. After this, the Americans left Borneo for a time. Among the nations of Western Europe, the desire for colonies was increasing. In Africa, the scramble was about to begin. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch, the British, and the French were on the threshold of great expansions of power and territory, and the aged colossus of China was even then being regarded as perhaps worthy of partition. It is in the spirit of this land-hungry age, then, that we find the empty spaces of North Borneo appealing to yet another new nation, Italy. In 1870, she conceived the plan of establishing a penal settlement on Bangui Island alongside Balambangan Island, where the East India Company factory had been sacked by pirates 100 years before, and of creating a ship depot in Gaya Bay, both in territory ceded to Tory. Their project was opposed by the British on Labuan and came to nothing, as did their plan for a penal settlement in Sumatra. The cessions granted to Moses and subsequently transferred to Tory had been for a period of 10 years. Tory had not lost hope of exploiting them in some way and endeavored to interest various people in them. He approached the government of the United States. It had informed the British in 1866 that Moses was acting on his own authority in securing the cessions, and it informed Tory that it did not encourage investments outside the United States. Nevertheless, although Tory was rebuffed, the American Navy appears to have considered several times the possibilities of Bangui Island as a naval depot, and the British, with painful memories of privateers in the Civil War, carefully noted its interest. Unsuccessful in the States, Tory was more lucky in Hong Kong, which, for a colony full of businessmen, was passing through a remarkable period of credulous optimism in regard to Borneo. In 1875, when the cessions were due to expire, he returned to Brunei with Baron von Overbeck, the Austrian consul general at Hong Kong, a large man, aged 44, of both courage and ability. A native of Lippe Detmold in Germany, he had spent his adult life firstly as a migrant to America, then as a whaler in the Bering Sea, based on the roaring hullabaloo that was Honolulu in the 1850s. And subsequently in business in Hong Kong, where he had assisted the Austrian government in several ways, and had been awarded a barony and consulate in return. He had been interested in the concessions as early as 1870, and he finally decided that they were worth preserving. In search of support, he interested two friends of his in London, Count Montulus at the Austro-Hungarian embassy, and A.B. Mitford, later Lord Redesdale, and some businessmen in Vienna. He visualized a highly profitable resale to his government, as yet colonyless, in a colony-grabbing era. With his friends, an agreement was signed on 11th July 1874, by which he was to provide £2,000, the others adding £1,000 each. He was to acquire the cessions and receive 2/3 of the profit from any resale. The businessmen were more cautious. Inquiries were made, strings were pulled, and nearly a year later, in May 1875, an Austrian corvette arrived at Labuan, having been attacked by pirates on the way. The captain inquired of Hugh Lowe what the prospects and position of the American Trading Company were. He was informed, and the information no doubt was passed on to the capitalists in Vienna who had instigated the inquiry, that no such company existed on the coast of Borneo. The Viennese interest faded. Overbeck, meanwhile, had returned from London, and in Hong Kong in January 1875, he purchased for $15,000 all the rights passed by Tory in the American Trading Company of Borneo, on the condition that within 9 months a renewal of the present leases should be obtained. Together they sailed to Brunei, where disaster in the shape of an aged and stubborn sultan awaited them. He refused to renew the leases, said nothing had been right with the American company from the beginning, and, strengthened by advice from Lowe on Labuan, rejected all their offers. They were more successful with the heir to the throne, the penniless and avaricious Pengurin Tumengong, and concluded an agreement with him. The American Trading Company was released from all past liabilities on payment of $1,000, and on 21st June, he signed a renewal of the leases for another 10 years. To this document, the Sultan refused to affix his chop, and Lowe pronounced it worthless. With this, Overbeck had to be content, however, and the pair returned to Hong Kong. Several others were by now interested in North Borneo. Wheelwright was endeavoring to obtain Gaia Island and the village of Gantisan on the mainland opposite. This came to nothing. Another who considered the possibilities of acquiring land in Borneo was a young Scotsman, William Clark Cowie. 20 years later, on returning to England, he became by degrees managing director and chairman of the chartered company, and historians have been misled by the claims he then made that he had founded North Borneo and that he had made it British. The facts are otherwise. He and Raja Brooke nearly strangled the company at birth. At this time, the Spaniards in the Philippines were engaged on one of their intermittent campaigns to conquer the Sulu archipelago, a chain of lovely, lonely islands stretching from the South Philippines to the horizon of eastern Borneo, an island group which they had been endeavoring to subject for the past 150 years. W.C. Cowie was the Borneo manager of a small Singapore firm, the Labuan Trading Company, which was endeavoring to make money out of this campaign by running the Spanish blockade of Jolo, the principal island, and there selling arms and other contraband to the Zulus. The diminutive ships of this gun-running concern were staffed with young adventurers, little different from the Germans of Macau, and plied from Labuan. To this port, a convenient caravanserai between Singapore and Sulu, there was one objection. It harbored a Spanish agent, a character fit for Conrad, Father Quarateron. A Spaniard from the Philippines, he had discovered while trading in those waters the wreck of a Manila galleon, one of those that traded yearly from Acapulco, laden with Mexican dollars for the silks and fine things of the East. Some of this wealth he salvaged, and inspired by a number of motives, religious, patriotic, and quixotic, established himself as a missionary in the stinking backwater of Labuan, there to labor for Spain on the nearby mainland. Several times the German and British captains of the company were surprised, their cargoes taken, and their bodies manhandled by the Spaniards acting on information sent them from Quarateron, the little steamer of the Sultan of Brunei, who had endeavored to secure a portion of the profits, became a Spanish gunboat. Cowie then obtained the permission of the Sultan of Sulu for his company to establish their depot deep in the immensity of Sandakan Bay on the other coast of Borneo, facing Sulu and completely isolated. Though in territory claimed by the Sultan of Brunei and ceded by him to Moses, it had been given to the Sulu Sultan in 1704 in return for helping suppress a rebellion. This vantage point, remote from the eyes of any other European, was also scarcely inhabited by the indigenous native. Then as now, the heavily timbered east coast of North Borneo had an extremely meager population. From a small kampong, or village, which became known as Kampong German, Cowie and those with him, Captain Ross, Otto Sachse, J.E. Hoft, Hans Olsen, Lerhart, R. Armstrong, A. Morton, L. Wyndham, and Captain Shuck, to rescue a few names from oblivion, slipped across to Sulu. Tory, however, waiting to be paid by Overbeck for the sessions, considered that he still possessed rights to the territory. So when Cowie arrived at Hong Kong in 1876 with a cargo from Sandakan, he was charged a percentage of the profits in lieu of export and import taxes by the American Raja of Mbong and Maradu. Cowie convinced Tory that the cessions as regards Sandakan were worthless, but was then interested by him in the advantages to be gained if he could secure a cession of the land from the Sultan of Sulu. He was urged to throw in his lot with Tory and share the profits either from the trade that could be developed there or from a resale to a European power. Cowie consulted Carl Schomburg in Singapore, the head of his company, who refused to consider the idea. The plan was abandoned shortly after the Labuan Trading Company found the profits of their trade disappearing. The company was wound up, and Cowie, securing one of its steamers, the very one he had helped bring out from Glasgow, went into a trading partnership with his friend, the still unconquered Sultan of Sulu. Overbeck, by this time, had spent nearly all his capital. He returned to London in an unsuccessful attempt to seek fresh funds from the embassy. Neither Mitford nor Montgelus were willing to advance more. He endeavored to seek aid from Germany, but his titles were not clear enough, and besides, he was a decade too soon, for Bismarck was not to undertake a Pacific expansion until later. In desperation, Overbeck approached Alfred Dent, the young head of the reorganized firm of Dent Brothers, with whom he had once worked. Dent was age 33, his brother 30. Neither was to be anything more than a normal, obscure, rather insignificant London businessman for the rest of his life. Yet in this enterprise, they were to work enthusiastically, courageously, and most tenaciously to accomplish great things. Especially outstanding was the ability and vigor of Alfred Dent, who saw immediately the possibilities of the scheme if backed with sufficient capital. His success was to have a significance far greater than could be imagined. Vast new territories in Asia and Africa were to be added to the white man's burden, and the British flag was to wave over the lands that had been primeval jungle when Overbeck met Dent in the city of London, on condition that the chief control and management of the affair be handed over to him. Dent advanced Overbeck £10,000 and sent him out to Borneo, and his was the powerful directory intelligence behind events from that time onward.